This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. This is Last Week in the Church, and I am your host, John Allen, the editor of Crux. This is the show where we sort through the flotsam and jetsam of the last 7 days on the Vatican and global church beat, looking for those few nuggets of gold that you actually need to have to understand what's going on. We begin this week with rethinking the peripheries. As we speak, Pope Francis is in Jakarta, Indonesia, starting a 12-day four-nation odyssey through Asia and Oceania. Been widely billed as a voyage to the peripheries. We're going to ask the question, is that really so? Second, we've got context is king. Catholic bishops in two powerhouse countries, Italy and Nigeria, have drawn diametrically opposing conclusions in the last few days on a very important question of what you might call political science. We'll ask, are they actually disagreeing, or is it simply that their situations are different? Third, we've got the General v. the Pope, the new front in Italy's culture wars, pits Pope Francis against a former army general turned politician who has become the most polarizing and divisive figure in the country. They are disagreeing, surprisingly not, over immigration. We'll explain what's going on. Fourth up this week, we've got the law of laws. In this case, law standing for lethal automated weapons systems. The Vatican is calling for a comprehensive ban at a moment when there is a boom market for these kinds of weapons. We'll try to unpack what the Vatican has said and why. And then finally this week, farewell to a friend. The recent death of one of the foremost Catholic theologians of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and also a good friend of mine, prompts reflection about why a figure who espoused kind of sanity, gentility, civility, and fairness is going to be so sorely missed on the Catholic landscape. All that and more is waiting for you this week on Last Week in the Church. So please, for the love of God, in the name of all the angels and the saints, everything that is holy, do not walk away, do not click away, do not change that dial, because I will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. We begin this week with rethinking the peripheries. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, right now, Pope Francis is in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, where he is beginning a four-nation, 12-day voyage to the heart of Asia and Oceania. He is going to be in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, East Timor, and then we'll wrap things up in Singapore before heading back to Rome. Now, in a great deal of media coverage, including, I freely confess, also here at Crux, we have described this as a voyage to the peripheries. That is, a trip that is completely consistent with Pope Francis's long-standing effort to reach out to corners of the world that are often not given their due, sometimes forgotten, sometimes marginalized, sometimes ignored. Now, that is a completely legitimate way, in a certain way, of framing this outing, because the truth of it is, in most Western media, popular conversation in Western Europe and North America and so forth, how often, really, do we talk about Indonesia or East Timor or Papua New Guinea or Singapore, right? And so you understand the logic for describing this as a kind of outreach to the peripheries. However, I want to suggest that this trip is also an invitation for us to reframe our perception of what counts as the periphery and what counts as the opposite of the peripheries, which of course would be the center, right? So the natural temptation in this situation is to think that Pope Francis is leaving the center, i.e. Rome, i.e. Western Europe, i.e. Western civilization, and going to the peripheries, i.e. the rest of the world. Now, let's begin with the fact that this notion that we are the center and the rest of the world is the periphery is a bit of a Western conceit, right? I mean, it betrays a certain arrogance, which is that, all the action revolves around us and everybody else is kind of on the outside looking in. But setting that aside, which is really just about sort of, cultural bias, let's talk about the situation in the Catholic Church. This notion that the West, that is Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, that the West constitutes the center of the Catholic faith. Well, I mean, look, that may have been true 5 centuries ago, it may have been true 10 centuries ago, but at least from a demographic point of view, ladies and gentlemen, it is not true anymore, and frankly hasn't been true for a while. The basic demographic reality of Catholicism is this: that today there are about 1.3 billion Roman Catholics in the world, of whom more than 2/3, 850 million, live outside the traditional borders of Western civilization. That is, they live in Asia, they live in Africa, they live in Latin America, they live in Middle East, they live in Eastern Europe. They do not live in the West. And if we look at projections, by the middle of this century, that is by the year 2050, that non-Western share of the Catholic population is going to be more than 3/4. In other words, within a generation, within 25 years, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive are going to be living outside the West. This, folks, is the most mammoth, most sweeping, most consequential transformation of Catholic demography, really since the 1st century, when St. Paul left Palestine and went to first Asia Minor and then ultimately Greece and Rome, thereby transforming Christianity from being a sect within Palestinian Judaism to a new religious movement in the ancient Greco-Roman world. I mean, that's the kind of order of magnitude we are talking about. Increasingly, the centers of energy, the centers of daring, the centers of imagination, the laboratories in which new Catholic movements, new Catholic instincts, new Catholic ideas are being formed, they are not in the West. They are in Africa, they are in Asia, they are in Latin America, they are in points beyond. I guess the point I'm trying to make is this. The truth of the matter is that from a demographic point of view, and remember Auguste Comte, the father of modern sociology, famously said that demography is destiny. From a demographic point of view, Pope Francis is not traveling from the center to the peripheries. He is instead traveling from the periphery to the center. Now, let's be clear. I don't necessarily mean that these 4 nations in themselves are the center of the Catholic story in the 21st century. I mean, the truth of it is, all in, combined, these 4 countries only have a Catholic population of about 12 million people, which is basically the Catholic population of Madagascar. Or to put it differently, it's the same number of Catholics who go to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico every year. So it's, and 8 million of them, 8.3 million of them are in Indonesia, which sounds like a lot until you realize that Indonesia has a population of 275 million, so that's only 3%. Okay. But these nations, because they lie outside the Western sphere, they are representative of where the action is in global Catholicism today. In other words, by choosing to travel to these countries, it is not that the Pope is making some kind of charitable gesture on behalf of irrelevant and meaningless places. On the contrary, history's first Pope from the developing world, history's first Pope from the global South, history's first Pope from the 2/3 world, is traveling to the places where he knows, and where anyone who is paying attention ought to know, that the Catholic future, well, in many ways the Catholic present, but certainly the Catholic future is being forged in these kinds of settings. Let me try to put this point differently. Let me speak for a moment to my fellow American Catholics. You know, the Achilles heel of American culture generally, and this includes American Catholicism, is that we are terribly insular. We tend to assume that our priorities, our experiences, our expectations ought to be the whole world's priorities, experiences, and expectations. I mean, let's face it, we manufacture culture. We don't import it, right? We make the movies the rest of the world watches. We make the TV shows the rest of the world watches. We make the music the rest of the world listens to. We write the books the rest of the world reads. And that's all tremendous. But what it means is we don't import culture, right? We really often have no idea what people in other places are experiencing and feeling and thinking and hoping and dreaming. And, the truth of it is that is going to be increasingly unsustainable as a strategy for survival in the contemporary Catholic Church. Again, a simple piece of math. 1.3 billion Catholics in the world, about 67 million Catholics in the United States. That means we are less than 6% of the global Catholic population. Put another way, 94% of the Catholics in the world are not Americans. They don't think like we do. They don't have the same sense of priorities and expectations that we have. Well, my point, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have to reframe what we consider to be central and what we consider to be peripheral. And I'm sorry to tell you, and if I'm the one to break this news to you, I apologize for the vertigo it might induce, but new reality, ladies and gentlemen, increasingly, we are the periphery. And where Pope Francis stands right now is the center. Get used to it. All right, second up this week, we've got an interesting tidbit, and that is context is king. Okay, so of late, that is within just the last week, two bishops' conferences in two robust and important Catholic nations, and those are Nigeria and Italy, Nigeria being the most populous nation in Africa, the world's largest mixed Christian-Muslim nation, with a very strong and dynamic Catholic community, and Italy, of course, being in some ways, the cradle of Western Christendom. The bishops in these two countries have both addressed the same question in what you might call political science. And the question is, which is better, a strong central government or a kind of loose confederation of largely autonomous regions or states? And they have drawn absolutely opposing conclusions. In Nigeria, the bishops are now arguing for devolution to a system of regional autonomy. Meanwhile, here in Italy, the bishops' conference is arguing that a proposal from the current center-right government to enhance regional autonomy is a profound mistake and would be an act of tremendous injustice. Now, the question to be asked here is, are these two bishops' conferences really disagreeing? Or is it simply that their circumstances are different? Well, I would argue it's mostly the latter. I mean, let's try to break it down. In Nigeria, there was, of course, a civil war in the 1960s, the Biafra War, in which a portion of the southern part of Nigeria wanted to secede and create an independent state called Biafra. For about 3 years, a bloody and devastating civil war was fought. At the end of it, the forces of northern Nigeria, that is, the forces of a unified Nigeria, prevailed, and the military that had put down this insurrection decided that in order to prevent further such difficulties, what was needed was to impose a strong system of central government and a kind of almost imperial presidency. And that system has endured roughly from the late 1960s to today. Now, of late, there have been proposals in Nigeria to rethink that decision, basically arguing that this system of an imperial presidency has failed, and what is needed is instead to devolve power to 7 sort of mega regions in Nigeria that would have broad control over budgeting, taxes and infrastructure and public services and so on. And these proposals have been backed in fairly explicit terms by some of the most important Catholic bishops in the country, including the president of the Nigerian Bishops' Conference and also the Archbishop Ignatius Kaigama in Abuja, the national capital. And their argument basically is that during this period of strong central rule in Nigeria, poverty has become worse, corruption has exploded, insecurity has become chronic, and in general, you're dealing with a kind of failed state. And underlying some of this, folks, and we ought to be clear about this, is the perception among many Christians in Nigeria, who tend to be especially predominant in the south of the country, that the military, which is dominated, the ranks of senior officers are dominated by Nigerians from the north, which is heavily Muslim. Many Nigerian Christians would perceive the military and the state to be excessively dominated by Muslims, and with sympathy in some circumstances and in some cases for the more radical Islamic elements in the country, and therefore kind of threatening to Christian interests. So you wrap all of that up, it is basically no surprise that the Nigerian bishops are saying that this experiment in military-imposed strong central rule has kind of run its course, and it's time for something different. In this case, that different being regionalism. Okay? Now, in Italy, meanwhile, the conservative government under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and enthusiastically backed by one of her coalition partners, the far-right Lega Party, which began life proposing that the north of Italy ought to secede and just create its own country, which has kind of backpedaled from some of that, but nevertheless still very much believes in enhancing regional authority. They have a proposal that would basically transfer powers in certain specified areas away from the central government and towards the regions. Now, in this case, the Italian bishops, led by the vice president of the conference, Bishop Francesco Savino, who is actually from the south of Italy, are foursquare against this proposal. In a recent interview with an Italian newspaper, Bishop Savino described this proposal for regional autonomy as a Trojan horse that was designed to sort of cut the South loose and abandon it to its fate, and meanwhile allow the North to rake in all the money and, basically wash its hands of any responsibility to anybody else. The backdrop to this is that since national unification in Italy, which, theoretically happened in 1861, when the Savoia dynasty sort of proclaimed the new Italian monarchy, and became physically real in 1870 with the collapse of the Papal States in the center part of the country and the complete geographic unification. Since that time, there has been a marked difference between a developed, prosperous, affluent, sophisticated North and a chronically underdeveloped, often sort of abandoned South. Indices of these disparities are all over the place. Let's just talk about the railroad system for a moment. The province of Lombardy in Italy, which is in the northern part of the country, it's the province, or the region rather, that includes Milan. Lombardy by itself has more miles of railway track than all 7 provinces in the south in Italy combined. Okay, take another example. Matera, which is a city in the Italian south, was promised a railway station in 1861 by the new rulers of a theoretically unified Italy. To this day, it does not have a railway station, so people in Matera often say that their train is late by about 163 years. Okay? And these kinds of disparities are what are on Bishop Savino's mind when he says that this proposal for regional autonomy is simply an abdication of responsibility by the North with regard to the South. Okay, so let's return to where we started. The Nigerian bishops are saying regionalism is great. The Italian bishops are saying regionalism is awful. Is that a disagreement? Or is it simply that their contexts are wildly different? That the experience of a strong central government in Nigeria has been extremely different than the experience of unification in Italy. And therefore, if the diagnosis is different, then obviously the prescribed cure is going to be different. I would suggest it's very much the latter. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I think makes an important point. That when bishops speak on political subjects, whether it's the Catholic bishops in the United States addressing, some cultural issue, whether it's a Supreme Court decision on abortion and gay marriage or whatever it is, or bishops in any other place address any other political question, we always have to remember that the answers they give are one part catechism, that is, eternal and unchanging Catholic teaching, but they're also one part context, fluid, malleable, ever-changing, specific circumstances driven by a particular moment in time. My point is that while principles are eternal, policy is always flexible, and therefore we should not be scandalized when bishops take differing positions. And more to the point, we also sometimes ought to encourage leaders in the church to recognize that when they appear to speak dogmatically on some political question, they ought to be careful, because the circumstances they're addressing today might not be the same circumstances they're addressing tomorrow. Okay, here endeth the lesson. Let's move on to our third topic this week, General v. Pope. So speaking of politics, here in Italy, just like in the United States and in many other parts of the world, immigration is perennially a hot button question. And it has been in the news again recently because the Catholic Church, very much including Pope Francis, has come out swinging against what is perceived as the kind of broadly anti-immigrant, or at least restrictive policies on migration of the current conservative government under Prime Minister Meloni. Last Wednesday, during his general audience, Pope Francis returned to migration, which is, of course, we're all aware, is one of his perennially favorite themes. And he used some language that many Italians took as a direct shot at the current government. He described rejecting migrants, policies of closed doors, restrictive laws as, and I'm quoting here, a grave sin. And that phrase made headlines all over the country, in part because, as I say, it was taken as a political position against the government. Now, it provoked all kinds of responses, but perhaps one of the most striking and most interesting responses came from a figure by the name of Roberto Vanacci. Now, Vanacci is well, I shouldn't say former, because he's actually arguing he is still a general, and he's contesting his dismissal from the armed forces. But anyway, a guy who used to wear the uniform of an army general, a distinguished combat veteran, fought in both Afghanistan and Iraq. He was actually, in 2018, I believe it was, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by the United States Armed Forces for his role in helping to combat Islamic extremism. So, distinguished, combat veteran, who has now become the biggest lightning rod, the most controversial political figure in Italy. He exploded onto the public scene in 2023 when he published a book called Il Mondo al Contrario, which basically means the world upside down, in which he took very polarizing positions, for instance, on gay rights, saying that homosexuality is not normal and that gays ought to, quote, get over it. He took a shot at immigrants, among other things, described a very popular women's volleyball player here in Italy who happens to be the daughter of Nigerian immigrants as having a body type that is just not Italian. He expressed skepticism on climate change. He came out against homeless people illegally occupying unused structures in major cities, which is a very common practice here in Italy, which has been supported, among other things, by the Pope's right-hand man on charitable issues, Cardinal Conrad Krajewski, who famously once, when the Italians tried to get some of these illegal squatters out of a building here in Rome by turning off the power, he actually went into this building, opened a manhole, went down, and with a wrench turned the power back on himself and said, "Send me the bill." Okay? And so, you have a very clear contrast here. Now, in response to the Pope's language describing anti-immigrant policies as a grave sin, Vanacci, who, by the way, is now a member of the European Parliament, he got elected in June. He collected more than 500,000 votes, the second most votes in Italy after Prime Minister Meloni herself. Vanacci came out and said, hey, look, with all due respect, the Vatican doesn't just let anybody walk in. I mean, they protect their own borders. Why can't we in Italy do the same thing? And then he said the best immigration policy is to make sure people don't leave in the first place. In other words, we need to keep them where they are. And, you know, if they do set sail for the country across the Mediterranean, then we ought to have very tough policies preventing them from entering the country and so on. So you have, you know, and obviously, and this has been played up significantly by the Italian media as a kind of clash between this right-wing populist maverick in Vanacci and, let's face it, a guy who, yeah, he's the Pope, but he is also in some ways a left-wing populist maverick in the person of Pope Francis. So you can understand why it is a terrific media storyline. But, you know, more deeply what it suggests is that even here in the Pope's own backyard, you know, the one country on earth more than any other, well, maybe, I don't know, Malta or something, but, you know, really probably the one country on earth where the Vatican and the papacy have a more direct influence on public affairs than any other, even here. You know, the Pope's ability to actually dictate outcomes and reshape the political landscape is limited. And Vanacci has obviously determined that taking on Pope Francis in public in the current environment, at least for him, is good politics. That his, you know, right-wing, conservative, anti-immigrant base is going to approve rather than disapprove of him crossing swords with Pope Francis in public. You know, whether that proves to be the case or not, we don't know. We'll have to see. But nevertheless, it is a fascinating contrast, and we'll continue to see how the story develops. So, just very briefly, fourth item this week, the law of laws referring to lethal automated weapon systems. Recently, the Vatican, in the person of the permanent observer to the United Nations, Archbishop Ettore Ballesteros, has called for a complete ban on these weapons. Ironically, this comes at a moment where both Ukraine and in Gaza, we have kind of a boom market for these, what are sometimes disparagingly referred to as killer robots. You know, automated drones, automated missile systems, you know, automated targeting packages, and so on. You know, the Holy See's position might be described as quixotic, but I would remind you it also in some ways illustrates the importance of the unique diplomatic status that the Vatican has, because frankly, there is no other actor on the world stage that would even be making this argument in the corridors of power. Archbishop Ballesteros argued that there is an important distinction to be made between a choice and a decision. That is, that a computer based on algorithms and so on can make a choice, but only a human being weighing not simply mechanical or logistical factors, but also ethical considerations. Only a human being can make a decision. They're calling for a ban. We'll see how that plays out. Finally, this week, I just want to pay brief tribute to the late Jesuit Father Gerald O'Collins, who died on August 22nd in his home in Melbourne, Australia, at the age of 93. For 33 years, Jerry O'Collins taught here in Rome at the Gregorian University. He was a Christologist, that is, expert in teaching on Christ. He directed the theses and dissertations of almost 2 entire generations of not only future theologians, but also future priests and bishops all over the world. He became a valued source and a good friend of mine. More than anything else, what Gerald Collins exuded was fairness. He had his own strong views, but he was eminently open to the views of people with whom he disagreed, and he abhorred nastiness. He abhorred rancor. He always strove to shed more light than heat on any question that he addressed. Beyond that, he was also just one of the world's nicest guys. He never made you feel like you were imposing on him, even when the truth was he had far better things to be doing than dealing with you in any given moment. I took maximum advantage of that generosity. Look, folks, we live in a time in which polarization, tribalism, anger, even hysteria, rage against people we perceive to be our enemies become the coin of the realm. We're swimming in it. In some ways, we're drowning in it. Gerald Collins was the exact opposite of all of that. And in addition to that, he was just a deep, true believer. He had this profound faith in the person of Jesus Christ that sustained him through everything. And so my great hope is that he is now in the presence of the person he once called the constant companion of his life, Christ, and that from that perch, he can become a patron saint of civility in our time, because God knows we badly need it. Gerald Collins, my friend, the dean of English language Christologists in the contemporary period, one of the great men of the Catholic Church. Requiescat in pace. Please, for the love of God, pray for us. That is our show for this week. You'll find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site. We'll be back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and we'll talk to you again very soon.